Hola, bienvenidos. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Patty Hetrick. I have the honor of being the Chief Financial Officer for the Hennepin County Library. I am so excited for this event. When I was 12, my family gained a sister from El Salvador for an exchange program. Since then, I've been intrigued with El Salvador and her beautiful people. She and her family had to flee El Salvador in the late 1970s. She is, and always will be, my sister. Tonight's program will be a moderated panel discussion of Solito, a memoir by Javier Zamora. There will be time for audience Q&A, and we ask that you submit your questions to our chat moderators in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of the screen. Closed captions are also available. Click on the arrow next to the CC icon and select Show Subtitles. At the end of the program, we will share a brief survey and ask that you take a few minutes to complete it. Your responses will help us improve future programs and tell the story of how our programs build community with partners and the public. First, though, I'd like to read the land and water acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. This land and the Dakota people belong together. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Dakota sovereignty and aspire to hold ourselves accountable to the work of reconciliation. We ask that community members take an action to learn more about the Indigenous communities who have resided for centuries in the area that is now Hennepin County. Folks can check out book lists created by the Hennepin County Library, participate in library events celebrating American Indian Month in Minnesota, and support local Indigenous organizations. The Mary Ann Key Book Club is made possible with funding support from the Friends of the Hennepin County Library. We'd also like to thank our media partner, Star Tribune. You can learn more about becoming a friend by clicking in the chat. And now I'd like to introduce Myron Medcalf. Welcome to our event tonight. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our fifth book, our fifth panel. Javier Zamora Solito, an incredible book about his journey from El Salvador to the United States as a 9-year-old boy. I started this book club with the help of our incredible partners, Hennepin County Library, Friends of the Hennepin County Library, Star Tribune. Thanks to all of them. I started to tell the stories of the unheard. My grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother was enslaved in the 1840s and 1850s. And her grandchildren would say when she got older in age, she would wander and they would find her and she would be singing a song. And the song she would sing would be about this journey across an ocean. Now, these are stories that have been passed down to her over time, but they will reflect how she spoke of wanting to go back, wanting to return, as if this land was not her home. And I hear the same sentiment when I read this book of Javier, a 9-year-old boy who's leaving so much behind to get to those he loves and all of the challenges in between. This is a story that I hope people have really taken time to digest and understand, because the immigrant experience in this country is not a monolith. These are individuals and human beings who all have their own stories. And I'm glad we're able to have this incredible panel discussion about Javier's. Now I'd like to introduce our incredible, esteemed panel that I'm so excited to hear everything they have to say tonight. Fernanda Acosta is an immigrant, organizer, and artist. She was born and raised in Mexico City and moved to Minnesota in 2010. She organizes with her base and community to change systems and conditions based on our shared experience living at the intersection of climate and immigration. Thank you, Fernanda, for being here and participating. Susana De Leon, our moderator tonight, is a community activist, traditional dance theater, and immigration attorney. Susana practices exclusively in the area of immigration and prioritizes the representation of crime victims, women who are victims of physical and sexual violence, children in cases of urgent humanitarian need. She is the co-director of Kalpulli KetzalCoatlicue, a community-based traditional Aztec dance circle made up of families seeking to maintain cultural ties to their indigenous ancestors. We also have Teresa Ortiz. She is a writer, spoken word poet, and educator. She's an immigrant from Mexico and a founding member of the 20-year-old Latin spoken word collective Palabristas. Teresa writes in English and Spanish to honor her ancestors and her loved ones, aiming to portray her identity, the land where she has lived, and lives that have touched her own. Teresa's poems have been published in several books and literary journals, and her short stories about immigrant children, El Rio and the Children's Mountain, were published in the anthologies Lake Street Stories and Home. For several decades, she has worked with adult basic education. She is the adult education manager at CLUES, Comunidades Latinas Unidas en Servicio. And now I hand it off to this esteemed panel. Thank you again. I look forward to this conversation about this incredible book.
Thank you, Myron. It is a pleasure to be here with you all on this night, and an honor to have this discussion upon this sacred land that we're on, acknowledging that we are here because our ancestors helped us get here. And so giving that respect first to the ancestors that rest upon this land and the ones that helped us come, we'll begin this discussion, this community, I would say, como una junta, ¿verdad? And so I am really honored to be here with Teresa and with Olinka, because I think as we talk about the book, we will help us, and as well as anybody listening, approach the subject. Sometimes this subject is really difficult to read about, difficult to hold on your own. But in a book club such as this, you're able to express your feelings and maybe make sense of what's going on. So I would like to ask Teresa and Olinka to tell us what their reaction is when we hear this boy, this voice that comes from a place of innocence, where he talks about, taking this trip, and the idea of a trip and how we might understand that word and what it really means for this 9-year-old boy and his innocence in describing, where he is and the people he loves and the people he misses. And now how that contrasts with the realities of the trip and the losses that begin to accumulate before he even leaves his place of origin in La Herradura, before he even takes the bus, because there is a process of departing that begins to take place and to take hold. So I would like to start with Teresa. And Teresa, if you can tell us, how do you see these expectations? How do they play out? And how do you see this child as he begins his journey?
What was incredible for me to read was that he tells the story from his own words. He tells the story as if, even though he's telling a memoir, he's telling his memories, he's telling it as he is living it. So the reality of what is happening day to day is amazing, that he tells us every little detail, and we follow him, we walk with him, and we feel it inside. And, when we see the news and everything that happens, it's like it becomes real. It becomes real to us that this is the reality, not only of Rubén Zamora, not only of Solito, it's the reality of thousands of unaccompanied minors that have come through this trek, this journey. He had to go through 4 different countries, like from El Salvador to Guatemala, from Guatemala to Mexico, and then from Mexico to the US. And every detail, and he's doing it with a family. And so how does that compare with his dreams of, when he left? He thought, I'm going, voy a la USA. I'm going to USA, to the United States, the USA, la USA. And it was like if he was like going to, I don't know, Disneyland or something like that. In his mind, that 9-year-old child, he thinks that that's what it is. But he goes through all this and he's just a kid, a little kid. And he tells us every single detail. To me, that was so heart-wrenching and at the same time so magical. I don't know to call it that, but it was like, because he had that innocence, he had that faith that he was going to make it. Yes, that's what to me was incredible.
And, you know, as he is telling the story and we are participating in it, there's this conversation, right? So I'd like to hear what Olinka has, you know, what's your experience?
Yeah, so just super quick, my parents, for whatever reason, decided that they were going to name me Olinka as my first name and then Fernanda as my middle name, but I went by Fernanda my entire life. Not really sure, but I also danced with Susana, and so since we're all about, you know, living in the tradition and really going back to our roots, that's why we kind of use both names. So don't worry about things. Olinka and Fernanda, I am both. We are one and the same. But getting to the question, I think what made this book so special for me was that, as Myron mentioned, my family came to the US in 2010. And at that point, I had just turned 13, which means that when I started reading it, I said, hey, a lot of this, I was resonating with it quite deeply because I was around the same age as Javier when my family started having those conversations about potentially coming here. And I got a peek of the book through one of my friends who had bought it before we even knew that this panel was going to happen, and she has a copy in English. And I said, you know what, I think I need to go back and read this in Spanish specifically, because at that point in my life, growing up in Mexico, in that family setting that I was in, Spanish is still my first language, and it very much was my first language at that point. So when Hennepin County Library reached out to see if I would be willing to participate in this panel, I said, yeah, it would be great if I could get a copy of the book in Spanish. And I think when I speak to folks in English and when I read this book in English, there's still a little bit of separation just because of the way that my brain works. But the second that I started reading it in Spanish, I felt like I was back in that headspace of a 9-10-year-old and perceiving the world around me. And even if Mexico City is it looks very different from La Herradura, at least in the way that it's described, I feel like I can picture it really well just because of the way that he describes it, and then me being back in that mindset of, oh yes, that is how you perceive the world at that age. And especially when it comes to immigration and having those conversations of, oh, here's what's happening and here's how we're going to have to make things work. It's very interesting to see how those views have evolved and how just the language itself is able to bring you back to a very specific place in your life.
So within that, you know, the question that I think many readers might have is, how does the parent agency work with the child? You're just describing your family having those discussions. You know, like looking back on it now and hearing what he had to say about, you know, interacting with the parents. What do you think about this, you know, parental child, and this is the decision?
I think there's always a bit of an illusion of choice. And this is speaking as the child, not as a parent that's making the decision. I think as a child, I always had an understanding of, yeah, it would be best if we make this trip and we move. Here's all the pros and cons list that we'll collectively make. But I think at that age, especially, there's always something that's left out. And you don't really have the level of maturity maybe to be in on those harder parts of the conversation. And I see that reflected in the book, in that I feel like we don't really get a glimpse into why the parents had to go in the first place. You know, I think we get a bit of an overview of why they had to leave, but we don't really hear from Javier directly. Here are all of the reasons that they decided, that all of the conditions that led to this decision. And at least for me, I think I resonated again a lot with it, because I had my own understanding of, oh, we're going to be able to have a better education. There's more green space. We can be outside without having to worry about all of the pollutants in the air. And as a woman, when I grow up, I'm not going to have to worry so much about my safety. But I think there's also things that as you grow up, you kind of have to start filling in the gaps for yourself.
And I think, going back to Teresa, it's really important because Teresa did a lot of work, around conditions that push people out of their environment and out of their communities. And Teresa, how would you come to the book in terms of the push to get out of the community?
Yeah, one of the questions that that is asked, I think, is like, and I think you go back to the question that, why would you have your child come here? Why that is a difficult, but the biggest question is, why do we allow our society to have this situation for families? I mean, this is a horrendous choice. I mean, what choice does a family have? Either you separate from your child and never see that child until it's an adult, or you make a difficult decision like this family did, of calling their child to come to the United States, so we have to look at so many different angles, it's like what was happening in El Salvador at that time. I mean, I lived in Central America in those years, and the situation was very, very difficult. And if the parents left even before that, it was even more difficult, So for the safety of the child to have, first of all, being taken care of by family, and then having that difficult journey to come here, it's a very difficult decision. And yet, what choice did people have? I mean, it's like staying and losing family members, coming here, separating. I mean, it's every choice is just difficult. It's just hard. And what was happening in those years, it's really terrible.
So for people who might not know a lot about the period that the book takes place in, it would be important to just like gloss over and say, oh, this is happening. But there are certain details that are very important, like Teresa is saying. So there is a civil war going in El Salvador. And the civil war is, touching a lot of people's lives in different ways. But there is also this question of how is this war being financed and to what end? And we often talk about, the interventions that the United States have in other countries. And the civil war in El Salvador has a lot of those interventions in terms of money, arms, support, and training that is occurring in the United States, parallel to the Soros, and parallel to the problems that people are encountering. The other thing that we also get a small glimpse about in the book is people who have been deported from the United States, people who were to La USA before, and that come back, and then they want to make it back to the United States. And so that will, not at this period, but we will know what that means later on when maras or gangs become prevalent in the United States, and when we look at what happened to youth coming into the United States during that period. We know that communities of colors are marginalized, and there are a lot of societal works at play. And so eventually this marginalization will take a different toll on El Salvador and its people. But it is important to get these glimpses, as Javier, as a 9-year-old boy, doesn't know what's going to happen, but he tells us, he's foretelling us, this is what's going to happen. And he also tells us, this is like kind of what happened, why I'm in this situation, because it's easy to just say like, why? As an immigration attorney, you know, cases take years and years and years to deal with. But one thing that is very clear is that the cruelty within the immigration system.
Yes.
And if we hear of Javier being put in a cage and being in a room where it was very cold, as an attorney, I've heard these stories from children who call the room the freezer. That's the name that that room has. Estaba en el congelador.
El congelador.
And that we as a society can not know about that, or can afford to not know about that. And so we see this child coming into, I mean, first crossing, right, the ocean. And that when things get really tough, this child can even think about the ocean not being as bad as the desert. And this is a child speaking to us. I would like to tell and hear about from the two of you. You know, we talk about family separation. We talk about children in cages. And the ultimate and most inhumane thing that we've heard was the separation of children from parents as they came through the border, which now, you know, after different administrations and different laws, we are seeing something new unfold. But even going back to what policies are at work, how do you, you know, come or approach the idea of these detentions and the idea of these children in detention, and Javier's very vivid description of what happens to him in detention, to what we have heard or thought about or think a child should receive as a treatment. Teresa, I'd like to start with you.
Well, you know, the whole concept of having children in detention is just, I mean, it is children in cages, like they say. It's just a terrible thing to do. And how many times we don't even pay attention to that? You know, the U.S. society doesn't even pay attention to that. But when we see the situation in this book, in this narrative of how a child feels, and it becomes very real. It becomes very, very real. But it is just one child that in hundreds and thousands of children that are experiencing that. You know, just today I saw something that was happening in Mexico of, you know, they call them migrants there, of, you know, people that were kind of like put in a horrible place, and then they found them there. This is happening all the time. This is happening all the time. So it's not just a story. It is the reality. And so how do we, as as human beings, how do we accept this situation? How do we accept that children are taken away from their parents? They're put in detention. They are put in places like that. How do we accept that?
Right. And then, like what you were saying about like coming to Mexico, there's this identity that begins to form when you call Indio, when that word is used over and over now to describe you, right? You are this person, and then suddenly you become an identity that you might or might not understand. I don't know, Olinka.
There's so many different ways that this can be taken, but I think going back to specifically the way that children are incarcerated, and I just think as a society as a whole, we've gotten to a point where there's a lot of active dehumanization that happens with children, and I can't help but think that it has something to do with the fact that, you know, they're not quite ready to enter the workforce just yet, and therefore you are seen as, you know, like not a fully formed human being. You know, so I think the dehumanization starts way before anyone gets to the border or to any of those situations where you're criminalized. And that's just one of the many symptoms of, again, as a society, how we've normalized seeing people, like assigning people a worth depending on what we're able to do for each other, rather than just coming in, accepting and acknowledging everyone's inherent right to be here and be human. Yeah, that's where my mind's at.
And so we have all these headlines, right, that talk about, and in really offensive words to describe children, particularly children. And we don't really know where there's this crossing, but we don't really understand that or know what's going on, what all of those things that are at work. What would you say, when you hear like that there is a surge, that people are just like gonna come over, and sometimes talked about like in terms of like an invasion. I don't know, Teresa.
Well, I think in this society, in Western society, some people are being not seen. They're invisible. And they're only visible if they are seen as a menace, as something that we are afraid of. How do we rationalize the concept that children are a menace? I mean, children are children. So how could they be, so even that doesn't make any sense. But then in Western society, children are the property. They don't have rights. They belong to families. So when they don't have families, or we think they don't have families, of course they do. Every child has a family. Every child has a mother and a father, but they've been separated because of the circumstances, because of the policies of our countries, of let's say it, of the United States. They've been separated, and therefore we still see them as, we don't want to talk about them. We don't want to see them as our kids, Our kids we love, but other kids, it's like, they're weird, they're thugs, they're not good, they're invisible. We don't see them. Either we don't see them, or we see them as a threat, which is the same situation with many times with people of color, not only immigrants, but people of color in general. Children are seen as a threat. And so this is generalized when it comes to immigrants and to migrants. It's like, oh, a big group of people are coming and they're going to take over and they're going to destroy our beautiful wall. And so we have to put them in cages, even though they are little kids.
And, also for the people listening to understand that the United States is a very recent phenomena because this land, this indigenous land, was here for thousands of years before Mexico was colonized in the 1500s. The United States, not until the 1600s, and so on and so forth. So if you think about it, of all the thousands of years that people were free to roam around, from one place to another, and how we, in this short period of time, have new political constructs that push back the humanity of people. So I'd like to, wrap up this section and then go into the question and answer. If we are not willing to look at the humanity of everyone, how do we grapple with the journey of this child and the many journeys of many other people, not just the children? But we get past reading this wonderful book and into some kind of policy, yes, and understand that this story it's a larger question of a society and our response to humanitarian crisis. I don't know, Olinka, would you like to take a stab?
Yeah, I mean, I think as someone who, even from the very beginning of my schooling and education, I was always a huge history buff, and I like to understand things from that very academic standpoint, if you will. I think it's really important to take a look at not just conditions or situations as they arise, but rather trying to go a little deeper and understand why they happened in the first place. And I think that it doesn't really matter if you're looking at something that's happening in Canada or what's happening to children in the United States or in Mexico or in Latin America. You should take a look at as many things as possible and then start to draw the different connections. And maybe it's a generational thing for me, but I feel like a lot of my peers are able to do that and see all of that because we were born into this age where we have the privilege of being able to access a lot of information. We have the world at our fingertips just with our phones. And so more than anything, yeah, I think that's what we can do. And I would encourage folks to get to know their history more and start thinking a little deeper about why things happen, because I think we get to a point where, people say history is going to repeat itself unless we take a look at it. And so clearly we have a big opportunity to influence the outcomes of our actions and the decisions that we're all collectively making.
Yeah. What do you think, Teresa?
Yeah, I think that I would echo that we need to learn, we need to be more informed, we need to be more educated, we need to read more books like this one and see movies like this, and really, and talk with our neighbors, talk with people that have lived through that experience, and or not, I mean, you don't have to you just have to have more empathy, number one, and then also learn more about what has happened, the history of our country, but the history also of the Americas in general, the history of what happened, why do people are leaving their country? I mean, wait a second, why is it that Solito had to come alone? And why was there a group of people coming? So read about it and learn about what happened in his country, in El Salvador, in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. What happened in Mexico? What happened in the United States? What was try to understand what is happening so that we have more empathy, so that we understand each other much better, and then also we can come up with solutions. And I think the same thing that you were saying, Fernanda, we don't want to repeat the history. We need to learn about it. So, and we are repeating it. You know, we are doing the same things that happened in the past. We're doing it again and again and again. So for those of us who are kind of like a little older than, you know, your average child, we also need to give the opportunity, because this new generation, like you were saying, it's the ones that are bringing a lot of new knowledge about what is happening today, because there's so much more access to information. We need to take advantage of that.
So I think of Javier as this new generation, because for him to get to this point where we're reading, writing is an exercise in healing, in coming full term to what happened to him. As we read that, you know, the chapters that they keep on moving, and you see a change on the child that didn't want to unwrap his presents and didn't want to play, you know, with them, or wanted to preserve them, because he was preserving a lot. It wasn't just the toy. It was preserving the motherly love. You know, he was with his mother a lot longer than his father. Preserving the illusion. I mean, he talks about going to a house with a pool and, you know, things, you know, that like there's all of this expectation. But, you know, he starts to drop little bits of that innocence as things happen, you know, when he decides to give his toys. So we, through the whole book, see this new generation inviting us into a journey, and not just, well, this child is here now at the border, let's cage him, and what do we do, right? But without going into later, you know, in the book, we see the journey of living, like dropping innocence, leaving things behind. And this is the generation that's calling us to re-examine even how we got here, or why it is that we are maybe desensitized as a community to the realities of the border. And there is this point in the book when they get picked up for the first time and they get mistreated. It's really bad. But then there's this, you know, this beauty of everything that's happening around, along with the hardships. And the second time, you know, when he said like they got lucky, when this officer lets them go. And I don't know, I mean, if you want to like bring us in and talk about like what's going through your mind, you know, there is this officer that's certainly, you know, maybe Chicano, that has a different approach, and how that talks about even history of colonization for our own people, our own, we say la raza, you know, because that's just a term that has come up over the 70s, that, you know, we are the people. I don't know, Teresa, do you have a lot of experience in this crossings with your work that you have done? I don't know if you want to, you know, talk to us a little bit about that intersection of race, coming, shedding, changing, and that how that plays for you, talking about the new generation.
About my generation, well, talking about like
you know, like how we see that.
Yeah, I think one of the things in the book that I was struck by is how the book he tells his own story, and then goes into how his parents felt when they found him, and how it was. He sees a reaction, and then also later on he goes back and decides to tell the story. I mean, there's many years between the time when he lived this story and the time when he told the story, right? It's a situation of trauma. It's a situation of, that you have to kind of like survive that trauma. And it takes a long time for you to be able to say, I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to tell this story that I live. And he does an amazing job. I think I have an echo. He does an amazing job of telling the story. I think that this is something that we who have, the people who have lived stories of trauma, it takes a long time for you to go back and tell the story. My generation, I think that one of the things that happened in people my age is that we have lived through so many different situations, especially those in our community, right? We come from different countries. We've come here. We have to put our lives together all over again. We have to meet new people. We have to, make a living and raise kids and everything else, in difficult circumstances. And we have left behind situations that are difficult too. So it's a situation that takes to go back and tell that story. I wonder how it was for him. I mean, that I'm also thinking about him as a person, and that is a question that I have. It's like, how was it to write that story? Not only that the story is amazing and that it's very similar to the stories of so many of the people that we know, but how was it for him to write that story? How he went back and told every single detail with so much detail. And when I'm reading it in English, it's like I'm reading in Spanish. I don't know how or why, but it's like the intonation is there of Salvadoreño and Mexicano is a little different, and the Guatemalteco. I mean, everybody has, even though their story, I was reading it in English, but it's just amazing that he does that it's such a gift that to be able to write like that, and it's a gift for us to read that.
Absolutely. And I think when we're talking about the ways that we could see and in a way almost like experience those losses of innocence along with him, I don't think that we can have that conversation about a loss of innocence without also talking about identity and how little by little you start to question the things that you've always known, just because I'm sure that Javier had a great support system in the family that cared for him his entire life while his parents were here. And at the end of the day, none of them have made this kind of trek. So even if he went back, to his safe space, that there's no guarantee that he would feel the same about them. And that's something that strikes kind of close to home for me, because again, I came here in the middle of my formative years. And I guarantee you that if I had stayed back home for longer, it would have been a completely different story. And for a while, it was really interesting because I would catch myself code switching pretty hard in that. And I'd like to tell people I have my English speaking personality and then I have my Spanish speaking personality. And it's like they're two completely different people. And it wasn't until, so for a little bit of context, I came to St. Paul and I went straight into St. Paul Public Schools, and I came from a pretty competitive academic background at home. And so I just went straight in on what I knew best, which was, you know, go to school, do really well, get good grades, that kind of stuff. And those spaces, fortunately or unfortunately, were very white. And especially as I got into my later years of schooling in high school, I went into the different advanced placement programs, things like that. And the people of color and the children of color in the classrooms, the numbers just kind of dwindled pretty quickly. And so I found myself being more and more removed from my own culture and maturing as an individual and growing into my own identity with that mindset of I am speaking Spanish, I live in the United States. And it wouldn't really be something that I was aware of until I went back home, where I tried talking to my grandma and my mom, and all of a sudden they're like, who are you? Who is this person? This is not who I raised. So that's always been really interesting to me. And I would love to have more of that conversation with Javier himself of what was this experience like for you as a fellow, you know, immigrant who came here as a child, and I'm sure you had some sort of interesting experience revisiting who you were and the kind of identity that you had as you were coming into the United States.
And that's really clear because, you know, he has this identity as a very successful student. And, you know, he's worried about doing his homework,
Scholarships.
you know, but this pressure too that we hear he feels that if he doesn't make it, he's going to be behind in school. And so he has a very high value on education, but then he starts to hear the word Indio or migrant. So these other identities that are not his are suddenly being thrown at him. And then eventually, you know, he's like hearing it with disdain. Not, you know, he's no longer this A student who, you know, got to go to the trip, but didn't go to Guatemala because he got good grades, right? But he becomes this other person in the eyes of everyone, in the eyes of a woman riding the bus. And I think it also speaks volumes of our identities as colonized people and internalized oppressions that we carry within us. And the lack of understanding, even in the countries that we come from the immigrant experience of people from Central America, or now people from Haiti, people from Somalia, Russians coming, and the different ways in which you're treated because of your skin color. There is a very big tone over the book on skin color, on what, you know, who looks lighter than whom, or, you know, darker, and what it all means, because within our societies, we're bringing that heritage of castas and being placed in a box because of just your skin color. Now, you know, all of that, suddenly he's a child of lighter skin, but not very light, you know, thrown into the mix, and then suddenly he's an Indio, an migrante, and it's been, you know, these words are spoken to him with a lot of disdain. So, you know, what it does to the psyche of a child to have to go through that. We do hear later, you know, how he fought to become a poet. And, you know, we know that from, you know, later on, to fight for inclusion as a poet and someone who's not a citizen or a resident, because we haven't gotten to that, right? There's still I have clients who have waited for 20 years for their status. And so we are here now with the youth in this status mix that we also hear or have a hint about in the book. I don't know, but I would like to really hear from you, Teresa, of you know, any more of your, you know, your wisdom for our listeners, for our participants, for the questions that are coming, and we see some of them already.
Yeah,
You know how to approach it in a more like open way.
do you mean that we should be looking at the questions and start answering them?
Yes, yes. You know, there are questions about family. I mean, I don't know if Myron, would you like to read some of these questions that we're getting?
Yeah, we can definitely start the Q&A session. That was an incredible conversation and just discussion that I really enjoyed hearing from everybody. It's a really powerful book that I feel like we could talk about for hours and hours. There's just so many different layers to it. But definitely we would like to get some of our incredible viewers and allow them to ask a few questions. Our first question is, what do you think about Javier's trust in others to look after his safety and his needs? I do think that's a profound part of the book, where he is Solito, but there are people who kind of take him in and say, I'm going to look after you. So for all three panelists, what did you think about that?
Well, I think that when he is with his family, when he is with his grandparents, with his grandfather and his aunt, he's like in a beautiful home environment, full of trust and he knows that if his grandfather says, you know, trust this person, he's going to trust that person. I mean, that is something that many times in indigenous communities, in rural communities, the children belong to everybody. they are kind of like cared by everybody. So he grew up in that kind of environment, and he knows he's going to go see his mom and dad. That's what he knows. That's what he was told by his grandfather, and he believed that. So when he is told, you trust other people because you're going to go with them, he does. You know, he trusts everybody, and it's just amazing. He is so innocent, but he's like very trusting, very innocent, very here I come type of kid.
I think within that too, you know, there's all these worries and fears that he has about, you know, being in that space, or even feeling a resentment because his grandpa gave money, so he will be watched, and he knows. And there is this, like Teresa was saying, this community, this cultural way of trusting one another, but at the same time saying they won't leave me because my grandpa did something, right? And another thing that I you know, find, there is this level of yearning to be in Patricia's arms, to be in a family. I mean, the four become his family. So he just gives to them because he says, they're not going to leave me. They didn't leave me like Marcelo did, right? And at the end, he doesn't want to leave Chino behind because now they're family. And there's this bond that grew over the weeks that they were together. And it speaks a lot, where strangers that have nothing would risk everything for these children, carry them on their backs, you know, keep them safe from cactuses and everything. And that's something that we might not understand, to the level of which people are willing to give to him.
And I think even in present context for everyone, but definitely for myself, as Myron mentioned at the very beginning, I don't think that immigration is a monolith by any means, but even if this core group of four people that were able to stick together don't know exactly where each of them came from or what their backgrounds are or what situations led them to be there, I think that there's an unspoken solidarity amongst all of them because they know that something happened and they don't need to know the details of what happened to still be incredibly empathetic and hold each other with grace and with that humanity that they just get stripped from them in every other context and every other like experience that they have along the way. And I think if anything, that's something that I would like for folks to take away from that book is that we don't need to know people's exact situations. We can just say, you know, existing in the kind of society and system that we do, chances are we have a lot more in common with each other than with the people that are all the way at the top.
One question that I see here is in terms of language, and I think we're all first language Spanish, right? Teresa, how did this having to learn how to speak Mexican basically? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that question is pretty interesting because it is about talking, different people talk different languages of Spanish, you know. I mean, it's like, I love it when like I have students from all over Latin America, and it's just so much fun when there's a word that in one country means something and another country means something else. But what really kind of was interesting about the book is something that is very real in our countries, and that is very sad at the same time, which is it's a form of racism, you know, just like just it's a form of discrimination. Just like in the United States, you have a Spanish accent, you know, a Latino accent, people will kind of like, hey, you need to learn English, you know, and even if you speak perfect English, like we do, right? But they kind of like, oh no, that's not how you pronounce this. That is a form of discrimination, but the same thing happens in Latin America, you know. So when he was going through, or when they were going through Mexico, he wanted to talk Mexican, because he didn't want to be treated differently. He didn't want to be treated like a migrant, which is what they are calling them. He wanted to pass as Mexican, just like we want to pass as American, right? You know, I mean, it is a way of it's passing, you know, like passing as a Mexican or passing as an American it is kind of hiding your true identity so that they do not discriminate you. And that's what he was doing. Even though he was a 9-year-old, he already knew that it's important to, and it's a survival technique.
It is definitely a survival skill. And this is something that people experience even within their own native countries. You know, there's plenty of indigenous people out there who have to actively suppress who they are, suppress their identities, abandon their languages. You know, he had to let go of Salvadoran Spanish, but before him and his family spoke Salvadoran Spanish, chances are they were speaking some other language. And so going back to the whole issue of identity, I just don't think that this is a first loss of innocence and identity that a lot of people in the Americas have had. And so that's really interesting to me. And, you know, it's an everyday reality for a lot of folks, and at least for me, yeah, I think it's kind of funny at times because even within the same country, you're not going to have the same way of speaking or the same words that you use. You know, when we communicate, it gets interesting because I'm from Mexico City, and it's very sometimes painfully evident that I'm from Mexico City, and Susana's not from Mexico City, so we learn a lot of each other's language even on a daily basis. which is always fun. And yeah, the last thing that I want to share is that I know that Latinx people, immigrant folks from south of the border aren't the only ones that experience this, and we're not the only ones that have ever experienced this. Throughout history, I think that when we start talking about white supremacy, it's not just about how do POC experience it and what does it do to us, but I think that everyone has a little bit, at least a little bit of it internalized. And we know that there's a lot of folks around the globe that have gone through the same things. And going back to what I had said earlier, we need to remember what we have in common the most. That's one of those pieces. You know, language loss is a very powerful tool for keeping people complacent, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And maybe it helps a little to give the context of my stepmom's family migrated from Norway, and she has one cousin who's super in touch with her roots and her tradition in Norway, and she's telling me these stories, and we have a lot of conversations about immigration and violence and all of these tools to perpetuate and reproduce oppression. And she told me that one day she said to the family, hey, if we're Norwegian and we're very proud of our heritage, how come we don't speak the language? And that's when she learned that her grandparents or great grandparents, when they had come here, they were also actively discriminated for, they were discriminated against for not speaking English. But it came at this very interesting point in time for Norway and for what it meant to be Norwegian, because they were just getting out of a bout of colonization. And while they were reclaiming the language and the tradition in Norway, the people that were coming to the United States were actively trying to stifle and do away with all of that tradition and all of that language. So yeah, I think those experiences kind of also expand my worldview and again, make it so that we're able to relate to people's stories. And going back to the whole point of learn what's happening, not just for you, but just for people in general.
I think that's important because many people who are here now can take that and go back and see what's in your past, what's in your own history that will help you connect to this story. Myron, I know we have another question somewhere.
Yeah.
You're gonna guide us to it.
Yeah, there are a lot of great questions, and I had a chance to speak to Javier, so some of the things that you all are talking about just sort of resonates with the answers he gave to me. But one of the things he talked about was just the difficulty of making the journey and how long it took him to be able to talk about it. And there was a question, and I thought about this as well. When you want to get to know someone and understand their experience, someone who's made that journey, knowing it's such a delicate experience for them, how would you approach that? If you're saying you want to know stories like Javier's, but you also don't want to re-traumatize someone who's gone through that experience?
Well, I think that that's exactly what it is. You know, it's like you don't want to. I mean, it is a tough question, and it is a tough. Some people don't want to talk about it. And there's a lot of reasons why. One of the reasons is, you know, we have a stigma in this country about people from out of here. And sometimes it is about papers, you know, so it's like, you don't want to say, oh, yeah, I'm coming from da-da-da, but, you know, people feel like maybe what you're asking is what is their legal status, you know, their immigration status. So that's kind of like a little tricky because people don't want to talk about that. I mean, unless it is with Susana, who is an immigration attorney, and it's gonna, you know, I mean, that's a different situation. Asking, you know, where are you from? And what was life in your country? If people like to talk, I am so proud of my country. You know, it's like when people say, oh, Mexico, and I go, Mexico, yay, you know, I mean, or El Salvador, wow, you know, people, we are very proud of our country. So now if some people are very willing, I do a little exercise with my students, and this is a writing exercise, and they call it a journey. And it is like talking in pairs where each person tells their own journey to hear. And it's up to them how much they want to say, and then they can write it. They can write their own journey. So that's kind of like a way of, allowing people to say as much as they want and as little as they want, because it is a traumatic experience, number one, and it is sometimes is seen as I don't want to talk about it, but some people really want to.
And sometimes, the process of writing it is what allows you to cry or to deal with it or to process it. We all have a lot of border crossing experiences, and they accumulate and they become a very deep wound. Yet this book, for me, was really healing. It was very deeply moving and caused me to cry. But it was healing, sometimes tears are very healing. I wanted to hold that boy in my arms. And I wanted to hold the parents too. The parents must have gone through it. We don't know, we don't hear them. But I wanted to hold the parents. I wanted to hold Mali, everybody, and say, somehow we're going to be okay. One of the experiences that I have in writing is of, hearing of people crossing, the people close to you, because we come from very mixed statuses families. And sometimes it is our own family crossing. And so to put it into perspective and not wound yourself anymore, like Myron was saying, not to relieve the trauma and the PTSD, it takes a delicate balance. And I am very thankful for the approach in this book, because Javier doesn't come out as speaking from victimhood. The literary approach is very healing and come out into, this is what happened. But he's not in that victimhood place anymore. We don't know, how that happened. Like he says, years of therapy. But it comes out very clearly in a different place.
Yeah, this is a recurring exercise that we have to do in organizing, or at the very least in the way that I do it and my peers do it. We say that it's a muscle that you need to develop and flex more and more with time. A lot of times at Unidos, we work primarily with Latinx folks, immigrants, mixed status families. And so a lot of times people don't really come from a highly privileged background where we have the connections, where we have, people's phone numbers and we can just call someone up and say, hey, we need immigration reform. Can you get working on that? No, we have to very much actively build the kind of collective power that we need to actively change our lives and make our conditions better. And I would say 8-9 times out of 10, people are just waiting for someone to ask them about their experience. As I said earlier, a lot of people are willing. And for those that aren't, I think it's all about making them feel seen, making them feel safe, and saying, hey, again, I don't need to know the details, but I got you. Even if I don't fully understand, I understand enough and I see you, and we know that, as they say, we have nothing to lose but our chains. So long as that's the case for you, then there's room for you in the community and there's room for you in the movement. And I firmly believe that everyone contributes in their own way. So maybe Javier is not going to help us out by giving a testimony at the Capitol, but as an artist, as a writer, this is what he's doing. This is his place within the movement. So yeah, I think just holding people with grace, meeting people where they're at, is going to make a big difference and make sure that folks aren't feeling like they're being, tokenized with that, or that they're just their stories and they don't deserve to be there just for existing.
Myron, I know there's a couple of more questions there. I don't know if we can try to get to them.
Yeah. Well, there was one that was interesting. Like I mentioned earlier, just this idea that he's a 9-year-old boy. That's the thought I had through this entire book, was he's 9 years old, experiencing these things. And the book title comes from, I think in the start of the 3rd chapter, he says, "I am Solito," alone. But yet there is a community that forms around him, Patricia and her daughters and some of the other people who sort of decided to look after him in a way in this sort of incredible journey. The question is, which story outside of Javier's maybe surprised you or moved you with some of the other characters that were introduced in this story? I'll start with Susana.
Well, I think for me, really to think about the people who are helping them through the journey, and to imagine that even though it's easier to think, all human smugglers, all these bad things, about the choices that they also have or don't have. And maybe some of them were people trying to cross in the first place who didn't make it. And to have someone hurt their foot and have to keep on walking because you are saying you're the mero and you're gonna make it through and you're the best, it surprised me, like the levels of communication. Even though I've heard about, how I've seen people when they first come full of, cactus on their faces, their legs, their hands. I've seen all of that, but I've never heard about the hoot or the whistles to try and, and communicate and to try and bring people safely. And I was just moved by thinking all of the things that people are going through, and you don't know what's moving them. Why would anybody cross the desert more than once? And yet you have entire groups of people doing it.
Yeah, I'm always moved by the parents, all of the folks in the family that stay behind, just because I know that it's really easy to start feeling like you are at fault, like you didn't do enough to give people in your family the opportunities that they needed in order to stay. And I think it's a really hard decision, as we've talked about already, when you do decide to leave. And for me, it hits, again, pretty close to home, because I know that it was not an easy decision for my mother to decide, hey, yes, like go with your dad and, see what's out there. And yeah, I mean, she's still in Mexico City. A lot of my family still lives in Mexico City. And I know that, I'm sure at least once a day or once a week or however often they think about, was this the right decision? Was it the right call? Was it really worth it? And yeah, I don't really have the answers to any of those questions. But again, that's why I always relate to the parents a lot, because it's not just the people that are actively leaving and going on these journeys, but it's also the families and everyone else that you're kind of leaving behind. You're not just leaving them behind, they're also losing someone. And you see it also in like Chipito's classmates, of even he's recalling, hey, some kids just don't show up for school one day and they never come back.
Well, for me, there's an image that I have of him in the shoulders of this young man that is carrying him through the desert, and just that kind of image is just amazing. That a family that at first they weren't very excited about being with this young man. They kind of like kept their distance, but then at the end they kind of like adopt him. They adopt this kid, and so it wasn't surprising. It was mostly heartwarming. How they took care of him and really did not abandon him for nothing, and how he kind of attached himself to them. That part was really, really heartwarming. And then when his own parents, it's like in the whole time, it's like you're wondering what his parents are thinking, where are they? Have they heard from him? Have they heard from the guy that, abandoned him? So it's like these questions are in my head about the parents, not that I don't trust the parents or that I don't trust their judgment. I'm just like, they must be worrying so much. That's what the whole book I was thinking, because when there's a child that is missing, it's like we worry about it so much, and they must have been worrying so much about him.
Yeah, I can't imagine what they were dealing with. So we have time for one more question. I actually have a question for the panel, and it's something that you mentioned earlier, Susana. If you had the opportunity to talk to that 9-year-old boy, what would you tell him? You could speak to him.
You know what? How they were saying over and over and over and over and over, you're gonna be okay. That's all you can say. You're gonna be okay. Cadejo, cadejitos, there's somewhere, Ángel de la Guarda, Tu Dulce Compañía, like you have to have trust that there's a higher power out there watching after you, because you want to tell him, I care for you, I love you, I want to hold you, I want you to heal, but you're gonna be okay. Even if you don't know if that child is gonna be okay, you can only give them hope.
Yeah, hope is a pretty big one, and I think for me it would be something along the lines of, don't be discouraged by the world that you are experiencing, because you can still have a say in what your world can look like.
Yeah, same thing. I mean, I would say have faith, have hope. You're a warrior, like you can tell, we can tell that little kid he had it in himself, He knew that he was going to see his mom and his dad, and he believed in that. So that level of faith was amazing.
Well, I want to thank this incredible panel and this incredible night just talking about this great book. We are fortunate enough to have Javier in a Q&A on Tuesday at Paulette Hall, Minneapolis Central Library, 6:30. So please come and join us for that. I want to thank Susana, Fernanda, Teresa for this great discussion that makes me want to go back and read the book again after hearing this conversation. Before we go, Susana, do you have any parting words? And then after you, I will close the show.
Thank you, everyone. I know there are people interested in continuing the conversation and looking at some more books. And I think, we're going to be at a library next week. We can certainly send some suggestions, but thank you to all the people who joined. And Myron, it's been a pleasure really preparing with you, Teresa and Olinka, Fernanda. It's what a treat for tonight. Thank you.
Well, I'm always grateful that people say yes, to participate in this. Book number 5 has been incredible. Thanks to the staff, Hennepin County Library, Star Tribune, friends of the Hennepin County Library, that we continue to make this book club named after my great-great-great-grandmother a reality. I think the one thing I kept thinking about in this book, in terms of how you would relate the two, my ancestor and Javier and his journey, and I think they both felt like they were in a country that was not their own. Yet there were people they loved and cared about that made their journeys worth it. And my hope would be that BIPOC communities across the board would come together and understand our similarities and being in a place that doesn't always feel like home, yet understanding that our ties to our communities and those around us allow us to make it our own. And I hope that's one of the messages, because that 9-year-old boy matters, and he deserved a chance to live and fight and thrive. And everybody like him matters as well. Thank you again. Thank you for joining us. I'm grateful. Good night.
Good night.